It was a Thursday afternoon in late September when I made the drive out to the old family property near Hanna, Alberta. The town itself had a population of barely 2,000 people, and my grandfather's farm sat another 15 kilometers outside even that small hub of civilization. I had inherited the place 6 months earlier when he passed away, but between work and life in Calgary, I had not found the time to visit until now. The lawyer handling the estate kept pushing me to at least inspect the property before deciding whether to sell it or keep it. So I loaded up my truck with some basic supplies and made the 2-hour drive east across the prairies. The landscape out there is harsh and beautiful in equal measure. Endless fields of wheat and canola stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional cluster of trees or abandoned farmhouse. As I turned off the main highway onto the gravel road that led to the property, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and unease. I'd only visited the farm a handful of times as a child, and my memories of it were vague at best. My grandfather had been a solitary man, not given to hosting family gatherings or encouraging visits. My father rarely spoke about him, and when he did, there was always a tension in his voice that I never quite understood. The farmhouse came into view as I crested a small hill. It was a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging front porch. The barn behind it had partially collapsed, and tall weeds had overtaken what used to be the yard. I parked my truck near the front steps and sat there for a moment, taking it all in. The silence out here was absolute. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, nothing but the whisper of wind through the dry grass. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat. I grabbed my flashlight and toolkit from the truck and approached the house. The front door was unlocked, which surprised me until I realized that out here there was probably no one around for miles to worry about. The hinges groaned as I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was stale and thick with dust. Furniture sat covered in white sheets like ghosts frozen in time. I walked through the main floor, examining the kitchen, living room, and small bathroom. Everything was dated, probably unchanged since the 1970s, but structurally the house seemed sound enough. It was when I opened the door to the basement that I felt the first real stirring of unease. The stairs descended into darkness, and even with my flashlight, I could only see a few feet ahead. The air that drifted up from below was noticeably colder and carried a damp, earthy smell that made my stomach tighten. I had no logical reason to feel nervous. It was just an old basement. But something about it made me hesitate at the top of those stairs for a long moment before I forced myself to descend. The basement was unfinished, with concrete walls and a dirt floor in some sections. Old tools hung on the walls, and wooden shelves held dusty jars of preserved vegetables that must have been decades old. I swept my flashlight around the space, noting the low ceiling and the support beams that divided the area into smaller sections. That was when I noticed something odd. In the far corner, there was a door. Not a typical basement door, but something that looked newer, out of place among the aged surroundings. It was made of heavy wood and had a deadbolt lock on the outside. I approached it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the confined space. The door had no handle on this side, only the lock. I slid the deadbolt open and pulled. The door swung toward me with surprising ease, revealing a small room beyond. I shone my flashlight inside and felt my breath catch in my throat. The walls of the room were covered in newspaper clippings, dozens of them, yellowed with age and pinned haphazardly across every surface. I stepped inside and began to read them. They were all about the same case, a disappearance that had occurred in 1983. A young woman named Sarah Kowalski had vanished without a trace from a farm outside Hanna. She'd been 22 years old. The articles detailed the search efforts, the investigation, the grief of her family. But there had never been any resolution. No body found, no suspects charged, no answers. My hands were shaking as I moved the flashlight across the walls. Why would my grandfather have this room? Why would he be obsessed with this case? I noticed other details then. scratches on the door frame, deep gouges in the wood, modifications to the room itself. The walls had been reinforced with additional layers of wood paneling. There were metal brackets on the floor that looked like they had once held something in place. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to reject the obvious conclusion that kept forcing itself forward. I heard the sound from upstairs before I could process it fully. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floorboards of the main level. I froze, my flashlight beam locked on the newspaper clippings in front of me. Someone else was in the house. I had not heard a car approach. I had not heard the front door open. But someone was definitely up there, and they were moving toward the basement door. I switched off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall of the small room, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs and stopped. I could hear breathing, steady and calm, not the breathing of someone who was startled or afraid. This person knew exactly where they were and what they were doing. Then the footsteps began descending the stairs, one slow step at a time. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself if this person meant me harm. My phone was in my pocket, but I had no service out here. I was completely alone with whoever this was. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused again. I could see the faint glow of a different flashlight playing across the basement walls through the crack in the door. Then a voice, male and rough with age, called out, "I know you're down here. I saw your truck outside." I did not respond. My mind was screaming at me to run, but there was no other exit from this room. The only way out was through the basement and up those stairs. I was trapped. "You must be the grandson," the voice continued. "I have been keeping an eye on this place since your grandfather passed, making sure no one disturbed anything important." The beam of his flashlight moved closer to the small room where I was hiding. I could see his shadow now, cast large and distorted on the concrete wall. He was a big man, and he moved with the careful deliberacy of someone who had done this before. "You found the room," he said, and now his voice was right outside the door. "That is unfortunate. Your grandfather and I had an understanding. He knew things about me, and I knew things about him. Mutually assured destruction, you might say. But you do not have that protection." He pushed the door open fully, and his flashlight beam found me immediately. He was older, probably in his 70s, with a weathered face and cold, calculating eyes. He was not holding a weapon that I could see, but his size alone was enough of a threat. I found my voice, though it came out weaker than I wanted. "What do you want?" He smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "I want you to understand that some things are better left buried. Your grandfather learned that lesson. He learned what happens in this area, what has always happened, and he learned to look the other way. That room you are standing in was his insurance policy. Evidence against me, kept safe in case I ever came after him. But he is gone now, and that changes things." "The girl," I said, the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. "Sarah Kowalski. You killed her." His smile widened. "Among others. This land is good for keeping secrets. Your grandfather knew about the first one, found what I had buried on the property line between his farm and mine. Instead of going to the police, he documented everything and built this little room. Told me that if anything ever happened to him, someone would find it and I would go to prison. So we had our arrangement. He stayed quiet, and I stayed away from his family. "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling my phone from my pocket even though I knew it was useless out here. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "No service, boy. We are too far from anything out here. That was always the beauty of it. I could do what I wanted, and no one would ever know. Your grandfather was smart enough to recognize that and make his peace with it. You should do the same." That was when I made my move. I threw my flashlight directly at his face as hard as I could and rushed past him while he recoiled. I heard him curse and stumble, but I did not look back. I ran for the stairs, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning with the effort. Behind me, I could hear him recovering, starting to chase. His footsteps were heavy on the stairs, but I had a head start. I burst through the basement door into the main level and ran for the front door. My truck keys were in my pocket, my truck just 30 feet away across the overgrown yard. I could hear him behind me crashing through the house, shouting something I could not make out over the sound of my own panicked breathing. I hit the front porch at a full sprint and nearly fell down the steps, catching myself on the railing at the last second. My hands fumbled with the truck door, precious seconds lost as I yanked it open and threw myself inside. I jammed the key into the ignition and the engine roared to life. Through the windshield, I could see him emerging from the house, moving toward me with that same deliberate pace. He was not running anymore. He did not need to. He knew this land, knew every road and path for miles, but I had my truck, and I had momentum. I threw the transmission into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The truck shot backward, gravel spraying from the tires. I cranked the wheel and spun the vehicle around, then shifted into drive and accelerated down the long driveway. In my rear view mirror, I could see him standing in the yard watching me go, his figure growing smaller, but never disappearing entirely until I crested the hill and lost sight of the property. I drove straight back to Calgary without stopping, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. Once I had cell service again, I pulled over and called the RCMP detachment in Hannah. I told them everything, about the room, the newspaper clippings, the man who had confronted me. I gave them directions to the property and a description of the man, though I realized I had never learned his name. The investigation that followed made regional news. Police excavated areas of my grandfather's property and the surrounding farms. They found remains, 3 sets of them, including Sarah Kowalski. The man was arrested 2 days later at his own farm, just 4 kilometers from my grandfather's place. His name was Douglas Peterson, and he had been a respected member of the community for over 50 years. The trial revealed the full extent of his crimes, spanning decades. My grandfather had indeed known and had remained silent, bound by fear and perhaps some twisted sense of rural code that I will never understand. I sold the property immediately after the police finished their investigation. I could not bear the thought of ever returning there, of walking through that house knowing what my grandfather had allowed to continue. Some people in Hannah called me a hero for bringing the truth to light. Others, those who had known my grandfather, looked at me with resentment, as if I had betrayed some unspoken agreement. I still have nightmares about that basement room, about the newspaper clippings, and the cold certainty in Douglas Peterson's eyes when he told me some things are better left buried. But the worst part, the thing that truly haunts me, is the question I will never be able to answer. How many times had my grandfather gone down into that basement, opened that locked door, and looked at those clippings? How many times had he reassured himself that his silence was justified, that his family's safety was worth the price of letting a monster walk free? I will never know, and perhaps that is the most disturbing truth of all. I have always been a runner. Since high school, I've made it a habit to go for a jog at least 4 times a week, and when I moved to the small town of Vulcan, Alberta for a teaching position, I was thrilled to discover the trail system that wound through the countryside just outside of town. Vulcan is tiny, with fewer than 2,000 residents, but the people are friendly, and the cost of living allowed me to actually save money on a teacher's salary. The trails became my escape, my way of clearing my head after long days in the classroom. It was late August, that perfect time of year, when the summer heat had broken, but the autumn chill had not yet arrived. I had finished my run and was doing my cool-down walk along the section of trail that ran parallel to a dense cluster of trees. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. I had my earbuds in, listening to a podcast, feeling completely at peace with the world. That peaceful feeling would not last. I first noticed the sound when I paused the podcast to catch my breath. It was a strange noise, almost like a cough or a bark. but deeper and more guttural than anything I had heard from the coyotes that occasionally appeared in the area. I pulled out my earbuds and stood still, listening. The sound came again, this time from somewhere within the tree line to my left. It was definitely an animal, but I could not identify what kind. Growing up in suburban Edmonton, my knowledge of wildlife was limited to the occasional deer or rabbit. This sound was different. It was wrong somehow, in a way I could not articulate. I told myself it was probably nothing to worry about. Vulcan was farm country, and strange animal sounds were likely part of the territory. I put my earbuds back in and continued walking toward the parking area where I had left my car, but I had only taken a few steps when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something large was moving through the trees, keeping pace with me. I stopped again and turned to look directly at the tree line. For a moment, I saw nothing but shadows and branches. Then it moved again, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. It was big, easily the size of a large deer or elk, but it was not moving like any four-legged animal I had ever seen. It was moving upright, on two legs, with a strange loping gait that looked both awkward and purposeful. I could not make out details through the trees, but I could see its silhouette clearly enough to know that whatever I was looking at should not exist. My rational mind tried to supply explanations. A person in a costume, a bear standing on its hind legs, anything that made sense. But none of those explanations felt right. I started walking faster, my eyes fixed on the tree line. The thing kept pace with me, moving parallel to the trail, never getting closer but never falling behind. My heart was pounding now, not from exertion but from pure animal fear. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I was still a quarter mile from the parking area, and I did not know if running would trigger some kind of chase response in whatever was following me. Then it made that sound again, that deep guttural noise that was part growl and part something else entirely. This time it was louder, more aggressive, and it came from much closer than before. I looked toward the tree line and saw that the thing had moved nearer to the trail. It was standing at the edge of the trees now, partially visible in the fading light. What I saw made my legs go weak. It was covered in dark fur or hair, matted and dirty looking. Its body was massively built, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past where its knees should be. But it was the eyes that terrified me most. They were reflecting the light, glowing with an amber color that was distinctly not human, and not quite animal either. They were fixed directly on me, unblinking, watching me with an intelligence that felt malicious. I did not make a conscious decision to run. My body simply took over, flooding with adrenaline, and I was sprinting down that trail faster than I had ever run in my life. Behind me, I heard crashing sounds as the thing entered the trail, no longer bothering to stay hidden in the trees. It was coming after me, and from the sound of its movement, it was fast, faster than I was. The trail curved ahead, and I knew that just around that bend was a steeper section that led down toward the parking area. If I could make it to my car, if I could just get inside and lock the doors, maybe I would be safe. I did not dare look back. I could hear it behind me, hear its breathing, heavy and labored but steady. The distance between us was closing. I rounded the curve and nearly fell as my foot caught on a root. I stumbled but managed to stay upright, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The parking area came into view, my little blue sedan sitting alone in the gravel lot. I had never been so happy to see my car in my entire life. 50 yards, 40, 30. The thing behind me made that sound again so close now that I could feel it vibrate in my chest. 20 yards. I fumbled in my running belt for my keys, my fingers clumsy with fear. 10 yards. I could hear it right behind me now, could hear its footfalls on the gravel. 5 yards. I reached my car and jammed the key into the door lock, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The lock clicked open and I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me and immediately hitting the lock button. Only then did I look back at the trail. It was standing at the edge of the parking area, just where the trail met the gravel. In the better light of the open space, I could see it more clearly, and what I saw defied everything I thought I knew about the natural world. It was easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller, with proportions that were disturbingly human-like but exaggerated. Its face was flat, almost ape-like, but with features that seemed wrong, asymmetrical. The eyes that had glowed in the forest were still fixed on me, still watching with that unsettling intelligence. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then, without any warning, it turned and loped back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I sat in my car, shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, unable to process what had just happened. I drove back to my apartment in town with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached. I kept checking my rear-view mirror, expecting to see something following me, but the road behind me remained empty. When I got home, I locked every door and window, drew all the curtains, and spent the rest of the evening on my couch, trying to convince myself that I had somehow misidentified what I had seen. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe the light had played tricks on me. Maybe my fear had caused me to imagine details that were not really there. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was not any animal I could explain away with rational thought. The next day, I made some careful inquiries at the school. I asked some of the other teachers, the ones who had lived in the area their whole lives, if there were any dangerous animals on the trails. They assured me that the worst I might encounter would be a coyote, or possibly a cougar, though cougar sightings were rare. I pressed a little harder, asked if anyone had ever reported seeing anything unusual. That was when I noticed the change in the room. The conversation, which had been light and casual, suddenly became awkward. People exchanged glances. One of the older teachers, a woman named Margaret, who had taught in Vulcan for over 30 years, quietly suggested we talk in her classroom. Once we were alone, Margaret closed the door and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. It was part concern, part resignation, and part something else. Fear, maybe, or respect. "You saw it," she said. It was not a question. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Margaret sighed and sat down at her desk, gesturing for me to take a seat as well. "People around here do not talk about it much," she said. "Not with outsiders, anyway. But there is something in those woods. There has been for as long as anyone can remember. The old-timers, the farmers whose families have been here for generations, they all know. They have their own name for it, but I will not repeat it. Speaking the name is considered bad luck." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "No one knows for sure," Margaret said. "Some think it is a bear or some kind of unknown animal. Others think it is something else, something that does not fit into our understanding of the natural world. What I can tell you is that people have been seeing it for decades, maybe longer, and the ones who see it, the ones who really see it up close like you did, they do not go back to those trails alone. Some of them leave town entirely." "Has it ever hurt anyone?" I asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Not that I know of," she finally said, "but there have been disappearances over the years. Hikers who went out and never came back. Animals found torn apart in ways that do not match any predator we have in this region. Could be coincidence, could be something else. Most people do not want to know the answer." I thanked Margaret for her honesty and left her classroom feeling even more unsettled than before. The fact that other people had seen this thing, that it was a known presence in the area, somehow made it worse. It meant I had not imagined it. It meant it was real. I stopped running on those trails. I found a route through town instead, circling the streets during daylight hours, never venturing near the tree line. Some of my colleagues noticed the change and understood without me having to explain. They had seen the look in my eyes, the same look that others before me had probably worn. the look of someone who had encountered something they could not forget. Months passed, and life went on. I threw myself into my teaching, built friendships in town, tried to move past the experience. But I never truly forgot. How could I? On clear nights, when I would look out my apartment window toward the dark expanse of countryside beyond the town limits, I would sometimes see movement in the distance. Something large, moving at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. I'm still in Vulcan. I still teach at the same school, but I never go near those trails, and I never go out after dark unless absolutely necessary, because I know what is out there in those woods, even if I cannot explain it or name it. I know that there are things in this world that exist outside our understanding, creatures that inhabit the spaces between what we know and what we fear. And I know that it saw me just as clearly as I saw it. That on that late August evening we looked into each other's eyes and recognized something. I cannot say what it recognized in me, but what I recognized in it was simple and terrifying. It was aware, it was intelligent, and it did not want to be known. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that it is still out there, moving through those trees, watching the trail for the next person who wanders too far from safety. I hope whoever that is, they are faster than I was. I hope they make it to their car in time, because I have the terrible suspicion that one day, someone will not be so lucky. I moved to Drumheller, Alberta in March of 2023 for what I thought would be a fresh start. After a difficult breakup and a dead-end job in Vancouver, the opportunity to work as a junior geologist at the Royal Tyrrell Museum felt like exactly what I needed. Drumheller is a small town, population around 8,000, nestled in the heart of the Alberta Badlands. The landscape is otherworldly, all canyons and hoodoos, and layers of ancient rock that tell stories millions of years old. It was perfect for someone like me who wanted to lose himself in work and forget about the chaos of his previous life. I found a room to rent in an old house on the east side of town. The landlord was an elderly man named Mr. Henriksen, who lived on the main floor while renting out the 3 bedrooms on the second floor to various tenants. The rent was cheap, the room was furnished, and Mr. Henriksen seemed pleasant enough during our initial meeting. He explained that the house had been in his family since the 1940s, and that he preferred to rent to quiet, professional types. I assured him I fit that description perfectly. The first week went smoothly. I settled into my new job, explored the town, and began to feel like I had made the right decision in moving. My room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the neighbor's yard and the coulees beyond. The other tenants kept to themselves. I would occasionally hear footsteps in the hallway or doors closing, but nothing out of the ordinary for a shared living situation. It was on my 8th day in the house that I first noticed something strange. I had come home from work around 6 in the evening and was heating up dinner in the small kitchen we shared on the second floor. As I stood at the microwave waiting for my food, I glanced at the clock on the wall. It read 6:17. When the microwave beeped a minute later, I looked at the clock again. It still read 6:17. I assumed the battery was dying and made a mental note to mention it to Mr. Henriksen. The next day, I experienced my first real moment of unease. I was getting ready for work in the morning, going through my usual routine. I made coffee, toasted a bagel, checked my phone for messages, standard morning activities. But as I was brushing my teeth, I had the strangest sensation of déjà vu. Not the mild kind where something feels vaguely familiar, but an intense, visceral certainty that I had already lived this exact moment. The angle of the light coming through the bathroom window, the taste of the toothpaste, the sound of a car starting outside. All of it felt like a perfect repetition of something that had already occurred. I shook it off as a side effect of stress or lack of sleep. But over the next few days, the feeling intensified. Small moments would trigger that same sense of repetition. A conversation with a coworker that I could have sworn we had already had, word for word. A commercial on television that I was certain I had seen the previous week, except the date in the corner showed it was a current broadcast. A song on the radio that I knew was about to play before the DJ announced it. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was paying closer attention to patterns than I realized. Maybe my subconscious was picking up on cues and making predictions that felt like memories. But the incidents kept happening, and they were becoming more specific and undeniable. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. I had just returned from the grocery store and was unpacking my bags in the kitchen when one of the other tenants, a nurse named Patricia, came in to make tea. We had not spoken much since I moved in, just polite nods in passing. But that evening, she struck up a conversation about the weather, mentioning that the forecast called for snow later in the week. As she spoke, I had that sensation again, but stronger than ever before. I knew exactly what she was going to say next. Not a guess or a hunch, but absolute knowledge. She would mention that her daughter was visiting from Calgary this weekend. She would ask if I had any plans for the weekend. She would make a joke about how there was not much to do in Drumheller compared to Vancouver. And then she would look at the clock, say it was already 8:30, and head back to her room. And that is exactly what happened. Every word, every gesture, exactly as I had known it would. When Patricia left the kitchen, I stood there staring at the clock on the wall. It read 8:30. I looked at my phone. 8:22. I checked the kitchen clock again. Still 8:30. That was when I realized the clock had been stuck at 8:30 for at least 10 minutes of our conversation. I went to find Mr. Henriksen immediately. He was in his living room watching television, and he seemed surprised by my urgency when I knocked on his door. I told him about the clock in the kitchen, how it seemed to be broken. He assured me he would replace the battery, but did not seem particularly concerned. I wanted to tell him about the other things, the déjà vu and the repeating moments, but I could not find the words to explain it without sounding insane. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed replaying the conversation with Patricia, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. But I could not shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with this house. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to use the bathroom. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed light coming from under the door of the room across from mine. The room was supposed to be vacant. Mr. Henriksen had mentioned that the previous tenant had moved out a few weeks before I arrived. I stood outside the door, listening. I could hear movement inside, the sound of someone walking around. Then I heard a voice, male, speaking in a low tone as if talking on the phone. I could not make out the words, but the rhythm and cadence were familiar. Too familiar. With a sinking feeling, I realized I was listening to myself. The voice on the other side of that door was having the exact conversation I had had with my mother 3 days earlier when I called to tell her I was settling in well. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. This was impossible. This could not be happening. I returned to my room and locked the door, spending the rest of the night sitting up in bed with the lights on, too frightened to close my eyes. The next morning, I told myself I had been half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But when I left my room and glanced at the door across the hall, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small whiteboard on the door where tenants could leave notes. On it, in my own handwriting, was a message I did not remember writing. It said, "Do not leave, not yet." I went straight to Mr. Henriksen and told him I needed to speak with him about the house. He invited me into his living room, and I explained everything: the déjà vu, the repeating moments, the clock, the voice in the empty room, the message on the whiteboard. I expected him to think I was crazy, to suggest I see a doctor or take some time off work. Instead, his expression grew grave and sad. "You are not the first," he said quietly. "The previous tenant in your room, he experienced the same things. He lasted about 3 weeks before he could not take it anymore. The one before him made it almost 2 months. I keep hoping that eventually someone will break the cycle, but so far, no one has." "What cycle?" I demanded. "What is happening in this house?" Mr. Henriksen stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a leather journal. He handed it to me. This belonged to the man who lived in your room in 1978. His name was Robert Marsh. Read it. I opened the journal and began to read. The entries started normally enough, documenting Robert's life in Drumheller, his work, his hopes for the future. But about 2 weeks in, the entries changed. He began describing experiences identical to mine, the déjà vu, the repeating moments, the sense that time was looping back on itself. The final entry was dated 6 weeks after he moved in. It simply said, "I cannot leave. Every time I try to drive away, I end up back at the house. It is as if the roads themselves loop back. I'm trapped in a cycle I do not understand. If anyone reads this, do not stay. Leave while you still can." I looked up at Mr. Henriksen and what happened to him. "He disappeared," the old man said. "Left everything behind in his room. His car was still parked outside, but he was gone. They never found him. The police assumed he had left on foot and met with some accident in the Badlands, but they never found a body." "And you kept renting the room?" I could not keep the anger out of my voice. "I have to," Mr. Henriksen said, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. "If the room stays empty, the phenomenon spreads to the rest of the house. Other tenants start experiencing it. I start experiencing it. But if someone is occupying that room, it stays contained to them. I know it is terrible, and I have tried everything to fix it. Priests, mediums, investigators. Nothing works. The house wants someone in that room." I stood up, the journal still clutched in my hands. "I am leaving. Right now." "You can try," Mr. Henriksen said sadly, "but I do not think it will let you go that easily. Not now that it has you in its grip." Robert tried to leave dozens of times, according to his journal. He always ended up back here. I did not believe him. I ran upstairs, threw my belongings into my suitcase, and carried everything down to my car. Mr. Henriksen watched from the porch, but did not try to stop me. I drove out of town, heading west toward Calgary. I was going to get as far away from Drumheller as possible and never look back. But something strange happened. The highway seemed longer than it should have been. I drove for what felt like an hour, but the landscape never changed. The same coulees, the same rock formations, the same sparse vegetation. I checked my GPS. It showed I was making progress, that I was getting closer to Calgary. But when I looked out the window, I could swear I was seeing the same landmarks over and over again. Then I crested a hill and saw Drumheller spread out below me. I was back at the east entrance to town, exactly where I had started. I checked my odometer. I'd driven 70 kilometers. I checked my GPS again. It showed I was in Calgary at the address I had been heading for. But my eyes showed me Drumheller. I sat in my car on the side of the road, fighting back panic. I tried again. This time I drove east toward Medicine Hat. Same result. After an hour of driving, I found myself back in Drumheller. I tried south, then north. Every direction led me back to the same place. Mr. Henriksen had been right. I could not leave. I have been in Drumheller for 8 months now. I still go to work, still maintain the appearance of a normal life. But I know the truth. I'm trapped in something I cannot understand or escape. The déjà vu continues. The moments repeat. And sometimes I catch glimpses of the other versions of myself that seem to exist in this house. The me that already lived through this day, or this week, or this month. Time is not linear here. It folds back on itself in ways that make my head hurt to think about. I have stopped trying to leave. The last tenant's journal mentioned that he could not leave, and his last entry said just one more day before he disappeared. I am terrified that if I keep trying to break free, I will end up like him. Gone, erased, lost in whatever temporal loop has claimed this house. So I stay, and I live the same days over and over, and I try not to think about what it means that I can sometimes hear my own voice in the empty room across the hall, living through conversations I have not yet had. If you ever find yourself in Drumheller looking for a place to rent, and an old man named Henriksen offers you a cheap room in his house, Do not take it. Walk away. Drive away. Get as far from that place as you can, because once the house has you, once you start experiencing those repeating moments, you will never truly be free. You will be trapped in an endless Tuesday or Wednesday or whatever day the house decides to loop for you, and eventually you will disappear like all the others, leaving nothing behind but a journal and a warning that no one will heed. I have always considered myself a practical person. I work as a wildlife biologist. I believe in data and observation, and I have spent countless nights camping alone in remote locations without ever feeling afraid. So when I planned a solo camping trip to the Alberta Badlands near the abandoned settlement of Blériot in June of last year, I expected nothing more than a peaceful weekend of hiking and photography. What I experienced instead has left me with questions I cannot answer and gaps in my memory that terrify me more than any explanation could. Blériot is a ghost town, one of many scattered across the prairies that were abandoned during the Dust Bowl era or shortly after. Only a few crumbling foundations remain, along with the skeletal frames of what were once homes and businesses. The landscape around it is harsh and beautiful, all eroded coulees and exposed layers of sedimentary rock. I had been wanting to explore the area for months, and I finally had a free weekend to make the trip. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late June. The drive from Edmonton had taken about 3 hours, and I spent the last 30 minutes on increasingly rough dirt roads until I reached the spot I had scouted on satellite imagery. It was a flat area near one of the old building foundations, sheltered from the wind by a low ridge. I set up my tent, organized my gear, and spent the remainder of the daylight exploring the immediate area and taking photographs of the ruins. The sun set around 9:30, and I made myself dinner on my camp stove while watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. The silence out there was absolute. No highway noise, no aircraft, not even the sound of insects. Just the occasional whisper of wind across the rocks. I felt completely at peace. I went to bed around 11, crawling into my sleeping bag with the satisfaction of a successful first day. That is the last clear memory I have for 8 days. The next thing I remember with any certainty is waking up in my tent with sunlight streaming through the fabric. I felt disoriented and groggy, as if I had overslept by hours. I checked my watch. It was 2 in the afternoon. That seemed odd, but I figured I must have been more exhausted than I realized. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, immediately noticing that something was wrong. My gear was scattered everywhere. My backpack was 20 feet from the tent, its contents strewn across the ground. My camera was sitting on top of one of the old foundations, positioned carefully, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. My camp stove was disassembled, the pieces arranged in a perfect circle around my tent. None of this made sense. I am meticulously organized when I camp. I would never leave my gear like this. I checked my phone, thinking maybe I had gotten drunk the previous night and forgotten, though I had not brought any alcohol with me. The phone was dead despite having been fully charged when I went to bed. I walked back to my truck to get my charging cable and noticed that the driver's side door was hanging open. I never leave doors open when camping in remote areas. It is an invitation for animals to get inside. I plugged my phone into the truck's USB port and waited for it to power on. When it did, I felt my stomach drop. The date showed June 23rd. I had arrived on June 15th. According to my phone, I had been out here for 8 days, but I only remembered one night. One single night. I scrolled through my photos with shaking hands. There were hundreds of images I did not remember taking. Pictures of the ruins from every conceivable angle, close-ups of rocks and plant life, selfies of me smiling at the camera, looking perfectly normal and happy. The timestamps on the photos showed they had been taken over the course of the entire week. Every day, multiple times per day, but I had no memory of taking any of them. Some of the photos were disturbing in ways I could not articulate. There was a series taken at night, the flash illuminating the darkness around my tent. In several of them, my camping gear had been arranged in strange patterns. Circles, spirals, lines radiating out from a central point. In one photo, my sleeping bag was spread out on the ground 50 feet from my tent, positioned as if someone had been lying there, staring up at the stars. The final series of photos was the most unsettling. They showed the old foundation of what must have been the largest building in Blériot, probably a general store or community hall. My belongings were arranged in a perfect circle around the foundation. My clothes, my food, my camping equipment, everything I had brought with me. And in the center of the foundation, barely visible in the photo, were marks scratched into the dirt, symbols or letters, I could not tell which. The photo was slightly out of focus, as if my hands had been shaking when I took it. I ran to the foundation. My belongings were still there, arranged exactly as they appeared in the photo. I stood at the edge of the circle, afraid to step inside, trying to understand what had happened to me. The marks in the dirt were still visible, though the wind had already begun to blur them. They looked like writing, but not in any alphabet I recognized. Crude lines and curves that suggested meaning without conveying it. That is when I noticed the marks on my arms. Scratches, dozens of them, running up and down my forearms. They were not deep, more like the kind of scratches you get from walking through brush, but I was wearing long sleeves and I could not remember taking them off all week. I checked the rest of my body. More scratches on my legs, a bruise on my left hip, dirt under my fingernails, evidence of a week of activity that I could not remember. I gathered my belongings with frantic urgency, throwing everything into my truck without bothering to organize or pack properly. I just wanted to leave. I needed to get back to civilization, to talk to someone, to figure out what had happened to me. But when I tried to start the truck, the engine would not turn over. The battery was completely dead, which made no sense because it was less than a year old. I sat in the driver's seat trying not to panic. I had no cell service out here. I was at least an hour's walk from the nearest occupied farmhouse, assuming I could even remember which direction to go. The sun was already past its peak, which meant I had maybe 6 hours of daylight left. I could walk out, or I could wait and hope someone came looking for me. But who would? I had told my coworkers I was taking a weekend camping trip. They would not expect me back until Monday. They probably had not even noticed I was missing yet. I decided to walk. I grabbed my water bottles, my phone even though it was useless, and a flashlight. I locked the truck and started walking down the dirt road I had driven in on. I'd gone maybe half a mile when I heard an engine. A farm truck appeared over a rise, heading toward me. I waved frantically and the driver, an older man in his 60s, pulled over. "You okay?" he asked, eyeing me with concern. I must have looked terrible. "My truck battery died," I said, which was true but felt like a vast understatement of my situation. "Could I get a ride to town?" He agreed without hesitation, and I climbed into his truck. During the drive, he asked me what I had been doing out here. I told him I was camping near Blériot. His expression changed immediately. "By yourself?" he asked. I nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're the third person in 2 years to come out of there looking confused and scared. Last one was a couple from Ontario. They said they lost 3 days with no memory of it. Before that, it was a young guy, university student. Same thing, lost time, scattered gear, no explanation." "Did they ever figure out what happened?" I asked. "No," he said. "Doctors could not find anything wrong with them. No drugs in their system, no signs of head trauma. Police investigated but found nothing suspicious. Eventually people stopped talking about it. Small town, you know, folks do not like mysteries that make them uncomfortable." He drove me to the RCMP detachment in Drumheller. I filed a report, though I could tell the officer taking my statement was skeptical. They sent a tow truck for my vehicle and suggested I see a doctor. I drove to the hospital in Calgary that same evening. They ran every test they could think of. Blood work, toxicology, brain scans. Everything came back normal. The doctor said I was in perfect health. and suggested the memory loss might be psychological, perhaps a response to stress or isolation. But I know it was not psychological. I know something happened to me in those 8 days, something I cannot remember, but that left physical evidence. The photos on my phone, the scratches on my arms, the symbols drawn in the dirt. Whatever it was real. I've tried to piece together what might have occurred. I've researched missing time experiences, looked into environmental factors that could cause memory loss, even considered the possibility of some kind of fugue state. None of it feels right. The deliberate arrangement of my belongings, the systematic documentation in photographs, the symbols, it all suggests intention and consciousness, but not my own. The worst part is the sense that something was done to me during those lost days, something I participated in but cannot recall. When I look at the selfies on my phone, at my smiling face, I do not recognize the expression. It looks like me, but it does not feel like me. It is as if someone else was inhabiting my body, going through the motions of camping and hiking while I was somewhere else entirely. I have not been camping alone since. I have not returned to the Badlands. I changed my phone number because I kept getting strange calls in the middle of the night where no one spoke, but I could hear wind and the sound of rocks shifting. I moved to a new apartment because I could not shake the feeling that something had followed me home from Blériot, that it was waiting for the right moment to take me back to wherever I was during those 8 missing days. Sometimes late at night, I have flashes of memory that might be dreams or might be something else. I see myself standing in a circle of stones under a sky full of stars. I see shadows moving at the edge of my vision, shapes that do not belong to any animal I know. I hear voices speaking in a language that predates any human tongue. And I feel a terrible certainty that I am supposed to remember something important, something that was shown to me or done to me, but the memory slips away as soon as I reach for it. I still have the photos on my phone. I've looked at them hundreds of times searching for clues. In one of the night photos, if you zoom in on the background, you can see something standing at the edge of the frame. It is too far away and too dark to make out details, but the proportions are wrong. Too tall, too thin, limbs that bend at angles that should not be possible. I showed it to colleagues, and they suggested it was a trick of shadow and light. But I know what I see. Whatever happened to me in Blériot, I was not alone. Something else was there, and it took 8 days of my life, for reasons I will never understand. I can only hope that it is satisfied with what it took, and that it will never come looking for the rest. I am a long-haul trucker, and I have driven through every province in Canada more times than I can count. I have seen stretches of highway so desolate that you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. I have weathered blizzards and ice storms and fog so thick you could barely see 10 feet ahead. Nothing has ever truly frightened me on the road until the night I stopped at the crossroads outside Dorothy, Alberta. Dorothy is barely a town anymore. Maybe 50 people live there, if that. It is one of those places that used to thrive when the railroad came through, but withered away when the trains stopped running. I had driven past it dozens of times over the years, usually in daylight, and never thought much about it. But on this particular night in October of last year, I was running behind schedule and my fuel gauge was dropping faster than I liked. The next town with a proper truck stop was still 2 hours away, and I did not want to risk running on empty in the middle of nowhere. I pulled into the small gas station in Dorothy around 11 at night. The place was ancient, one of those old-fashioned setups with a single pump and a tiny convenience store attached. An old man sat behind the counter, watching a portable television with terrible reception. He looked up when I walked in, and I saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or concern. "Evening," I said, heading for the coffee machine in the corner. "Evening," he replied, but his tone was cautious. "You just passing through?" "That is the plan," I said, filling a styrofoam cup with coffee that looked like it had been sitting there since morning. Need to make Calgary by dawn. The old man nodded slowly. You take Highway 41 north out of here? I was planning to, I said. Why? He was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. There is a crossroads about 10 kilometers north, old intersection, where a side road used to connect to a homestead. The homestead is long gone, but the roads are still there, just dirt tracks now. Okay, I said, not sure where he was going with this. Do not stop there, he said, and the seriousness in his voice made me look up from counting out bills for the coffee. If your truck breaks down, if you get a flat tire, if anything happens at that crossroads, do not stop. Do whatever you can to get past it before you pull over. Trust me on this. I have met my share of superstitious people on the road, folks who believe in bad luck and cursed stretches of highway. I usually just nod politely and move on, but something about the way this old man looked at me made my skin prickle. What is at the crossroads? I asked. Nothing you want to meet, he said. Nothing anyone wants to meet. People who stop there, sometimes they do not leave the same as they arrived. Sometimes they do not leave at all. I thanked him for the warning, paid for my coffee, and headed back to my truck. I told myself it was just small-town folklore, the kind of story people tell to make their boring lives more interesting. But as I pulled back onto the highway and continued north, I could not shake the uneasiness that had settled over me. The highway was completely empty. No other vehicles in either direction, no lights except my own headlights cutting through the darkness. The landscape out here is flat and featureless, just endless prairie stretching away on both sides. I drove for about 15 minutes before I saw the crossroads ahead. 2 dirt roads intersecting the highway, one on each side, forming a perfect cross. In the middle of the intersection, barely visible in my headlights, was an old wooden post with weathered boards nailed to it. The kind of marker that used to show directions to homesteads or towns that no longer existed. I was going to drive straight through without a second thought. But as I approached the intersection, my truck began to shudder. The engine made a grinding sound I had never heard before, and the steering wheel jerked hard to the right. I fought to keep the truck on the road, but it was pulling toward the crossroads with a force that did not feel mechanical. It felt deliberate. The truck came to a stop directly in the center of the crossroads, the engine dying completely. I sat there in the sudden silence, my heart hammering, remembering the old man's warning. Do not stop at the crossroads. But I had not chosen to stop. The truck had stopped on its own. I tried to restart the engine. The key turned, but nothing happened. Not even the clicking sound you get from a dead battery. Just absolute silence. I checked my phone. No signal, which was not surprising out here. I was completely alone. That is when I noticed the wooden post. It was directly in front of my truck, maybe 10 feet away, and I could see now that the boards nailed to it had writing carved into them. Not painted, carved directly into the wood. The letters were crude and deep, as if someone had spent hours gouging them out with a knife. I could not read what they said from inside the truck. I know what you're thinking. Stay in the truck, lock the doors, and wait for another vehicle to come by. That is exactly what I was thinking too. But the longer I sat there, the more I felt compelled to look at those boards, to read what was carved into them. It was not curiosity. It was something stronger, something that felt like it was coming from outside my own mind, an insistence that I needed to see what was written there. I opened the truck door and stepped down onto the pavement. The night was absolutely still. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just the kind of silence that feels wrong, as if the world is holding its breath. I walked toward the wooden post, my boots echoing on the asphalt. The carvings were names, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every inch of the boards. Some were old and weathered, barely legible. Others looked fresh, the wood still, light where it had been cut. I recognized a few of the names. Missing persons cases I had heard about on the news over the years. a family that vanished while driving through Alberta in the 80s, a trucker who disappeared without a trace 5 years ago, a hitchhiker who was last seen on this highway. My hands started shaking. This was not folklore. This was real. People had stopped at this crossroads and something had happened to them. Something bad enough that their names ended up carved into this post. That is when I heard the voice. It came from behind me, from the direction of the dirt road that led east. A whisper at first, barely audible, speaking words I could not quite make out. Then louder, clearer, forming sounds that might have been a language but did not match anything I had ever heard. It was wrong in the same way the silence was wrong, in the same way the truck stopping here had been wrong. I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. At first, I saw nothing, just the dirt road disappearing into darkness. Then I noticed movement. Something tall was standing about 50 feet down that road, partially obscured by shadow. As I stared at it, it took a step forward into the faint spill of my truck's parking lights. I cannot adequately describe what I saw. It had the approximate shape of a person, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with limbs that seemed to have extra joints. Its face was the worst part. Flat and featureless except for a mouth that was too wide, stretched in something that might have been a smile but conveyed no warmth or humor. Just hunger. It spoke again, and this time I understood one word mixed in with the incomprehensible sounds. My name. It said my name in a voice that sounded like wind through a cracked window. I ran back to my truck, threw myself into the driver's seat, and turned the key with shaking hands. The engine roared to life immediately, as if it had never been dead at all. I did not question it. I slammed the truck into gear and floored the accelerator, feeling the tires screech as I left the crossroads behind. I drove for 2 hours straight without stopping, adrenaline flooding my system, checking my mirrors every few seconds to make sure nothing was following me. When I finally pulled into the truck stop outside Calgary, I sat in the parking lot for 30 minutes trying to calm down before I could trust myself to walk inside. I filed a report with the RCMP the next day. I told them about the crossroads, about the wooden post with the names carved into it, about what I had seen. The officer who took my statement was professional but skeptical. He said they would send someone to check it out. I gave them exact coordinates from my GPS, the intersection of Highway 41 and those 2 dirt roads. 2 days later, I got a call. They had found the crossroads. They had found the wooden post, but according to the officer, the post had no carvings on it, just an old weathered marker with a few rusted nails sticking out. No names. No evidence that anything had ever been written there. I know what I saw. I know what I read on those boards. I know that thing I encountered was real, no matter how impossible it sounds. But I also know that no one will ever believe me, just like they have probably not believed the others who stopped at that crossroads and lived to tell about it. I have changed my routes. I do not drive through Dorothy anymore. I do not care if it adds 3 hours to my trip. I will take the long way around, drive on major highways with plenty of traffic, stay away from those empty stretches of road where things that should not exist wait in the darkness. And I will never forget the last thing I saw as I drove away from that crossroads. In my rearview mirror, just for a second before it vanished, I saw the thing standing in the middle of the intersection. It was not watching me leave. It was carving something into the wooden post with one of those impossibly long fingers, adding another name to the collection. I pray it was not mine. I have always been drawn to abandoned places. There is something fascinating about walking through spaces that were once filled with life and activity, seeing the layers of history left behind. As an urban explorer and photographer, I have documented dozens of abandoned sites across Western Canada, factories, hospitals, schools, you name it. I have never been afraid of these places. The dead do not scare me. It is the living you have to worry about. That was my philosophy until I explored the old coal mine near Wayne, Alberta. Wayne is a ghost town in the truest sense. It sits in a valley outside Drumheller, accessible by a winding road that crosses the Rosebud River 11 times via a series of old wooden bridges. At its peak in the 1920s, Wayne had a population of over 2,000 people working in the numerous coal mines that honeycombed the surrounding hills. Today, fewer than 30 people live there, and most of the mine entrances have been sealed or collapsed. Most, but not all. I had heard about one particular mine from another explorer I met at a convention in Calgary. He told me it was accessible if you knew where to look, and that the interior was relatively stable. He also mentioned that very few people explored it because the locals strongly discouraged anyone from going near it. That, of course, made me want to see it even more. I convinced my friend Sarah to come with me. She was less experienced than I was, but eager to learn, and I felt better having someone along as a safety precaution. We made the drive out to Wayne on a Saturday in September, arriving around 10 in the morning. The weather was perfect, clear and cool, ideal for spending several hours underground. Finding the mine entrance took longer than I expected. It was not marked on any map, and we had to hike about 2 kilometers up a steep hillside, following vague directions and looking for landmarks. When we finally found it, I understood why it had remained relatively unknown. The entrance was partially hidden by brush and was only about 4 feet high, requiring us to crouch to enter. A rusted chain with a faded warning sign had been strung across the opening at some point, but had long since been broken. We ducked inside, switching on our headlamps and letting our eyes adjust to the darkness. The tunnel was rough-hewn, with wooden support beams that looked frighteningly old and unstable. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and the air had that distinctive underground smell of damp earth and minerals. We moved slowly, testing each step, documenting everything with our cameras. About 50 meters in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. This appeared to be a work area, with the remains of old equipment scattered around. Rusted tools, pieces of rail track, a collapsed wheelbarrow. Sarah was excited, taking photos of everything while I examined the walls and ceiling for signs of instability. That was when I noticed the second tunnel branching off from the chamber, heading deeper into the hillside. "Should we check it out?" Sarah asked, following my gaze. I hesitated. Our rule was to never go deeper than we could safely retreat from if something went wrong. But the tunnel looked solid, and I could see that it widened further in. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We followed the second tunnel for what I estimated was another 100 meters, passing through 2 more chambers before we reached a section that made me stop in my tracks. The walls here were different. Instead of rough mining cuts, they had been deliberately smoothed and reinforced with concrete. This was not original mine construction. Someone had done this much more recently. "Abigail," Sarah said quietly, and I heard the tension in her voice. "Look at this." She was standing near a recess in the wall that looked like it had been carved out deliberately. Inside the recess were items that clearly did not belong in an abandoned mine. Blankets, relatively new and folded neatly, plastic bottles of water, non-perishable food in sealed containers, and most disturbing, a collection of women's jewelry spread out on a flat rock like a display. My stomach tightened. Someone was using this mine. Someone was living here, or at least spending significant time here. And based on what I was seeing, they were not here